Welcome back to On the Same Page. We are on Daf Lamed Ches Amud Beis, 38b of Maseches Kiddushin. We are about halfway down the page by the 2 dots. The Gemara is discussing a brisa where we had the opinion of Rabbi Elazar b'Rabbi Shimon. And Rabbi Elazar b'Rabbi Shimon said, it's really at the top of this page, that any mitzvah for which the Jewish people were already commanded in before they entered the land of Israel, so those apply both in Israel and outside of Israel. And he says, any mitzvah that they only received once or only applied once they entered the land of Israel, so those only apply in Israel. And basically, according to Rabbi Elazar b'Rabbi Shimon, at least on a Torah level, all the agricultural laws only apply in Israel. They do not apply in Chutz La'aretz. They don't apply outside of Israel. Now he said that there's 2 exceptions. There are 2 mitzvos that they only became obligated in when they entered the land, and yet they still apply outside of Israel. They're not agricultural mitzvos, but this is how he says it. These are the 2 exceptions. The first one was Hashmatas Ksafim, the cancellation of debts. He says that the exceptions are, even though they only began when they entered the land of Israel, they still apply outside of Israel. So number 1, Hashmatas Ksafim, canceling debts at the end of the Shemitah year. And number 2, Shiluach Avadim, setting one's slaves free at the Yovel year. So last week the Gemara asked, what do you mean that Hashmatas Ksafim, cancellation of debts, only applied once they entered the land of Israel? That's a chovas haguf, that's an obligation on the person. It's not agricultural. It should have applied even before and even after. So the Gemara explained that that's because it is dependent on the laws of Shemitah, and when the laws of Shemitah are in effect, then the laws of Shemitah of the land, then the laws of canceling debts are also in effect, and when the laws of Shemitah are not in effect, then canceling debts are not in effect. So it is dependent on them being in the land of Israel, the Jewish people, but yet it still applies outside the land of Israel. Now we're picking up from about halfway down the page, the beginning of the line. It says Shiluach Avadim. So this was the other exception, he said, was Shiluach Avadim, sending away slaves. Rabbi Elazar b'Rabbi Shimon said, by sending away we mean setting free. Rabbi Elazar b'Rabbi Shimon said that even though that only began to apply when they entered the land of Israel, still it applies even outside of Israel. So the Gemara asks, Shiluach Avadim chovas hagufi, setting your slaves free, that's an obligation on the person, that's not agricultural. Why would I think that it has anything to do with the land? Why would he have to specifically tell me? First of all, why would it only apply once they entered the land of Israel? Seemingly, if somebody would have had an Eved, a slave in the desert, and a Yovel year would have come around, they would have to set that slave free. And not only that, but just in general, why would I think that it only applies in Israel, that he needs to tell me that it applies even outside of Israel? It's a chovas haguf, it's an obligation on the person, it's not agricultural. So the Gemara says, Sakadaita Chamina, I might have thought to say, Ho'il uksiv. Since the pasuk says, with regards to setting the slaves free at Yovel, it says, Ukrasim dror ba'aretz. You should declare freedom in the land. So it says in the land. Ba'aretz in, b'chutz la'aretz lo. I might have said in the land of Israel, yes. Outside the land of Israel, no. And outside the land of Israel, there's no obligation to set one's slaves free at Yovel. Talmud Lomar. That's why the Torah says, Yovel hi. It is Yovel mikol makom, which teaches us anywhere. The Torah, the pasuk says, you should declare freedom for all of its inhabitants. Yovel hi, it's Yovel. Now that's extra. So why do we need the extra? It's Yovel. So the Gemara is saying that's trying to tell you that it's Yovel everywhere. These laws apply no matter where you are. So that's So that's why Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon had to tell me that Shiluach Avadim, setting the slaves free, applies everywhere, because I might have thought, since it says Ba'aretz in the land, that it only applies in Israel. He came and told me, no, it applies everywhere, because it says Yovel Hi. Im Kein Matam Lomar Ba'aretz. So if so, what does it mean when it says in the land? If it doesn't mean in the land of Israel? So the Gemara explains, it's telling me, Bizman Shahadiror Noheg Ba'aretz, Noheg B'chutz La'aretz. What it means is that at a time when Duror, when setting the slaves free, applies in the land of Israel, so then it also applies outside the land of Israel. But Ein Duror Noeg Ba'aretz, but when it does not apply in Israel, Eino Noeg B'chutz La'aretz, it also does not apply outside of Israel. So the halacha of setting the slaves free at Yovel only applies when Yovel is in effect. And Yovel is only in effect when all of the Shvatim, all the tribes of Israel are dwelling in the land of Israel. I don't think it means everybody in the world, but there's the presence of all the Shvatim in Israel, all the tribes. So, which is not assumed to be the case now, because we lost many tribes, and we don't assume that. So at any point in history when you don't have all the tribes, so Yovel is not in effect, and if Yovel is not in effect in Israel, that means also the aspect of Yovel of setting the slaves free is not in effect. And what it's telling us by saying Ba'aretz in the land, it's telling us when Yovel applies in the land, it will also apply Yovel Hi everywhere, it will apply outside the land. But when Yovel is not in effect in the land of Israel, so then it's also not in effect outside the land of Israel. In general, though, Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon is saying, but in general, when Yovel is in effect in Israel, it's in effect outside of Israel, and Yovel applies, setting the slaves free applies even outside of Israel. Okay. Tanan Hassam. We learned in a Mishnah in Arla, in Maseches Arla. The Mishnah says, HaChadash Asr min HaTorah b'chol makom. Chadash, eating from the new crop, the new wheat crop, new barley crop, before Pesach, before the bringing of the Karban Omer on the second day of Pesach, is Asr min HaTorah. It's forbidding Midoraisa by Torah law, b'chol makom, everywhere. Not just in Israel, even outside of Israel. So this Mishnah holds that Chadash applies on a Torah level even outside of Israel. Arla, what about Arla not benefiting from the fruit of a tree during its first 3 years? Halacha, that's a halacha. What do we mean by that's a halacha? Not clear. We'll discuss it momentarily. V'kilayim, and kilayim, mixed breeding plants, produce, midivrei sofrim, that's derabanan, that's rabbinic. So it says chadash, everywhere, chadash basically outside of Israel is doraisa, is Torah law. Arla is halacha, whatever that means, and kilayim is derabanan. Ask the Gemara, my halacha, what does it mean that it's halacha? Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. Rav Yehuda says the name of Shmuel, Hilchasa Medina. It's the halacha of the province, of the location, meaning it's a minhag, it's a custom. So he interpreted the Mishnah when it says that Arla, outside of Israel, is a halacha, means it's the halacha of the place, the practice of the place, it's the minhag, it's the custom. But it's not derais, it's not Torah law. Ula Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Ula says the name of Rabbi Yochanan, no, that's not what it means. Halacha l'Moshe miSinai. What it means is that it is what does halacha mean? Halacha l'Moshe miSinai. It is a halacha passed down from Moshe at Har Sinai, which means it's deraisa, it's Torah law. It's not written explicitly in the Torah. It's halacha l'Moshe miSinai, but it is Torah law. So we have here a machlokus, a dispute how to understand the Mishnah with regards to Arla in Chutz La'aretz, outside the land of Israel. The first opinion said it's a custom. Second opinion says it's a deraisa, it's halacha l'Moshe miSinai, it's Torah law. Amar le Ula Rav Yehuda. So Ula said to Rav Yehuda, Ula, who's the one who's saying it's deraisa, it's Torah law, he says, Bishlam al-Yadidi, it makes sense according to me. De'amina halacha l'Moshe miSinai, that I'm saying that Arla outside of Israel is halacha Moshe. We're seeing it's a tradition from Moshe. It's a deoraisa. Hainu d'shanilan ben safik Arla la safik kilayim. Then we can understand that there's a difference between Arla, for which I'm not certain about, if it's Arla, and kilayim, crossbreeded plants that I'm not sure if they are actually crossbreeded, potentially crossbreeded. Safek Arla and Safek Kilayim, there's a difference in the halacha, as we're about to see. And he says it makes sense according to me that I say Arla is de'araisa in Chutz La'aretz, as opposed to Kilayim, which will be derabanan. Then it makes sense that, which the Mishnah says is derabanan. It says explicitly, divrei sofrim, it's derabanan, it's rabbinic. So it makes sense that there's a difference. What is the difference? D'Tanan, we learned in a Mishnah, Safek Arla Ba'aretz. If you have Safek Arla, you're not sure if it's Arla. It might have come from a tree, this fruit might be from a tree in its first 3 years, it might not be. So, but it's in the land of Israel, which means it's for sure Deoraisa. It's Aser. It's a Safek Deoraisa. It's Aser. It's a Daura Deoraisa, and it's forbidden. Bisuria, if it's outside the land of Israel, but it's in Syria, which is very close to Israel, Dabar HaMelech conquered it and almost made it part of Israel in a certain sense, but it's not actually the land of Israel. So there, we say it's mutter. It's permitted to have Arla that's in doubt. Now, it's permitted, but you can't sort of set it up to have it. As we're about to see, you could do in Chutz La'aretz. So it's permitted if you happen upon some fruit that might be Arla, you'd be allowed to consume it. Because we're assuming basically that outside of Israel, even if it's Deoraisa Arla, but it's a more lenient level of Deoraisa, that when there's a doubt on it, it's actually permitted. We'll see as it goes. B'chutz La'aretz, now outside the land of Israel, not including Syria. Syria is very similar to Israel, so that we're more strict. But if it's really outside of Israel, Yored v'lokeach, you're allowed to go to the field and buy from the non-Jew who is growing Arla in his field, uvilvad shelo yirenu loked, as long as you don't see him harvesting from Arla trees. So he has a bunch of trees. Some of them are Arla, some of them are not. So if you see him actually taking from Arla, then it's not a doubt anymore. You can't buy that fruit. However, if you didn't see him, it has both. It has new trees, it has old trees. You didn't see him picking, and he brings out his basket of fruit. Some of them are Arla, some of them aren't. But it's Safek Arla. Each individual one is a Safek. It's a doubt. So you're allowed to buy it from him. Even though you know that it came from this field that has possible Arla in it. So that's the story with Arla. So again, Arla that's potential Arla. In Israel, Aser. Safek Deoraisa, it's a Safek a Daura and Deoraisa, it's forbidden. In Syria, so we're not as comfortable with it because it's similar to Israel, it's right there. But at the end of the day, it's not part of Israel. And so the halacha that Safek Arla in Chutz La'aretz, Arla that's endowed outside of Israel, is permitted completely. So you're really allowed to have it from Syria. However, we still don't want you to actively go and buy from a field that you know the guy just picked from and has doubt. So we say it's mutter, it's allowed to be consumed, but you're not allowed to go to the field to buy in that way. But outside of Syria, if you're anywhere else in the world, basically, so then it's allowed to even go up to the field and buy the fruit. As long as there's a doubt on the fruit, that any individual fruit, whether it's Arla. That's all with regards to Arla. Now the Mishnah continues, and it says, the Mishnah that we're quoting, and it says, and the Gemara says, Ve'ilu gabi kilayim, But with regards to kilayim, which is the crossbreeded plants, Tanan, the Mishnah says, Kerem hanatua yarek. If you have a vineyard that is planted near vegetables, so there's interbreeding going on, it's kilayim. V'yarek nimkar chutzala. And there are vegetables being sold right outside. So it's a non-Jew, he owns the field. He's sitting at the table outside selling vegetables, and it seems very likely these vegetables came from that field. They're kilayim. So, ba'aretz aser. In the land of Israel, they are forbidden. Because kilayim in Israel is d'oraisa, and you can't even you can't plant them, you can't eat them. B'Suria, mutter. In Syria, they would be permitted to be consumed, if you had them already. V'chutz la'aretz, again, because outside of Israel, it's only, the Mishnah says it's only d'Rabbanan, it's midivrei sofrim. It's d'Rabbanan, and on a doubt, we're lenient. B'chutz la'aretz, and if you're really outside of Israel, even outside of Syria, yored v'lokate, you can go down to the field, and you can instruct the non-Jew to pick them, even if you know they're arla. Uvilvad shelo yilkot biyad. You just can't collect them with your hands. You just can't be the one to collect it yourself. So here, right, the kilayim in chutz la'aretz, outside the land of Israel, is only rabbinic, and the prohibition is to plant it or to pick it, but not to eat it. So therefore, as long as the non-Jew is the one who's picking it, so then it's fine. So this is the two Mishnahs. So when it comes to Arla, it says that, again, in Israel, it's completely forbidden. In Syria, you're allowed to have it, but you can't actively, I guess, go and get it. If it's already been picked, you're allowed to get it. But you can't instruct the farmer to go and pick it in Syria. Outside of Israel and outside of Syria, when it comes to Arla, you can even tell him to go pick it. As long as you don't see him pick, saying it's going to be a suffix, it will be a doubt, and you're allowed to have it. That's with regards to Arla. With regards to kilayim, in Israel, forbidden to have it. In Syria, you're allowed to have it, you just can't tell the farmer to pick it. Outside of Israel, you're even allowed to see him pick it. You just can't be the one to pick it. You're allowed to eat it. You can't plant kilayim, and you can't pick kilayim. If you would pick it, it would be sort of like you're showing ownership, even if you don't actually own it. So you can't pick it, but you could even watch the guy, the farmer, the non-Jewish farmer, pick the kilayim. So what are we getting at? So says Ula, according to me, it makes sense that there's a difference between Arla and kilayim in chutz la'aretz. That because I say that Arla in chutz la'aretz is d'oraisa, it's halach l'Moshe miSinai. So we're not going to be so lenient as to say that you can even go and instruct him and even see what he picks. It will be then it won't be a suffix. It won't be a doubt on it anymore. It has to be a doubt at least. So you can tell him to pick if you don't see, as long as you don't see. But kilayim is not. It's divrei sofrim. Everybody agrees that's d'Rabbanan. It's rabbinic, and it's permitted. Even you don't need a doubt, as long as you're not the one who picks it. As long as the Gentile picks it, you're allowed to have it. So for me, says Ula, it makes sense that there's a distinction in the halacha because they're different. Arla is halacha Moshe Misinai, and kilayim is derabanan, is rabbinic. Elo l'didach, but says Ula to Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, says Ula to Rav Yehuda, according to you, Nisni ozev v'zeh yored v'lokech, ozev v'zeh yored v'loket. It should be consistent. They're both rabbinic, according to you, at best. Right? He's sort of saying it's like the custom almost, but they're both at best rabbinic. So they should be equal. Either both, you should be allowed to go and buy as long as you don't see him picking. So that would be a down on it. Or it should be that both you're allowed to actually go and tell him to pick and watch him pick. But why should there be a difference in the halacha? So the Gemara says, Ha'amar le Shmuel Rabbanan. Shmuel actually said to Rabbanan to resolve that question, Tani ozev v'zeh yored v'lokech, ozev v'zeh yored v'loket. Really, yeah, you read that into the Mishnah. That really, by both, you have both options. That you can either, or actually, it should say, yeah, that's really what it should say. It should either say by both that you can go and pick as long as, sorry, not pick, but go and instruct him to pick as long as you don't see him, if that's the standard that we need, or they should both say that you can go and actually tell him to pick and actually see him picking. You're right, they should be consistent, and we have to modify it. That's Shmuel's response. Fine. Now, which one is it? Meaning, so what is the halacha going to be in terms of permissibility to instruct the non-Jew to go pick it? So the Gemara says, Mar Breder Ravana, Mar the son of Ravana, Masni Leilakula. He went to the lenient side. Zabazeh Yored Velocate. He held that the proper reading of the Mishnah, of these two Mishnayos, is that in both cases, Yored Velocate. You're allowed to go and tell the non-Jew to pick, as long as you don't pick it with your hands. So he's very lenient. It seems like it doesn't even have to be a doubt. Even for Arla, you just can't pick it yourself. That's how Mar, the son of Ravana, came out. Others require that it be a doubt. So the Gemara says, Amar le Levi l'Shmuel. Levi said to Shmuel, Aryoch, that was his nickname for Shmuel, apparently means like royalty. Safek li vana echol. Go, collect for me, and I'll eat. Meaning, he said, you go pick the fruit. Don't tell me what kind of tree it came from. For me it will be a doubt, and I'll eat. Because Arla that's in doubt outside the land of Israel is permitted. So, and apparently you're even allowed to engineer the doubt. So he said to Shmuel, you go pick for me, and I'll eat, because I won't know if it's Arla or not. It seems like you're allowed to engineer the doubt, you don't have to verify it, you don't have to try to verify it, so it's very lenient. Rav Avia v'Rabba bar Rav Chanan, misafku sfuki ladadi. Rav Avia and Rabba bar Rav Chanan, they would actually do that to each other. They would supply each other with fruit, not tell each other if it's Arla or not, and therefore it would be in doubt, and they each be allowed to consume it. The Gemara says, and again, this is all about Arla outside the land of Israel. In the land of Israel, even when it's in doubt, it's forbidden. Outside the land of Israel, if it's in doubt, it's completely permitted. Amri Charifi de Pumpadisa, the sharp ones from the Sigi of Pumpadisa, they said, Ein Arla b'chutz la'aretz. Arla doesn't apply at all in Chutz La'aretz, outside the land of Israel. Doesn't apply at all. Shalcha Rabbi Yehuda l'kamed Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yehuda sent a message to Rabbi Yochanan. Shlach le, send a message. So he sent to Rabbi Yochanan, informing him what the people of Pumpadisa were saying, these sharp ones of Pumpadisa. So Rabbi Yochanan sent back, Shalach le, stam sveika. Be quiet about how Arla that's in doubt is permitted. Don't share that with the public. Ve'avad vada. And any certain Arla you should destroy. And you should declare about the fruits of the people in Pumbedisa, of these elders, these sharp ones, that they require geniza. They have to be buried. So basically, since it's leading to too much leniency, so he said, we shouldn't be telling people that arla that's in doubt is permitted, and therefore don't report that, don't publicize that. You should tell people that certain vadai arla, if it's certainly arla, it needs to be destroyed, and we should announce that the fruit of these elders has to be gones. You have to bury it. And he said that anybody who says that there's no such thing as arla outside the land of Israel, he won't have a child or a grandchild that's mashlich chevel b'garal b'kal Hashem. Quotes a verse, but that will send forth the rope in the portion of the nation of Hashem. Basically, it's like he's giving a curse that anybody who says there's no such thing as arla outside the land of Israel, their offspring will be disconnected from, either they won't have offspring or their offspring will be disconnected from the nation of God. So he was not happy that they were saying that there's no arla outside of Israel. V'inu kiman savrua. The Gemara asks, saying, who did they hold like? Kihad Tanya, like we learning a brisa. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Yossi, Omer, Mishum, Rabbi Yossi ben Durmaska. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Yossi sang in the name of Rabbi Yossi, the son of Durmaska, Sha'amar Mishum Rabbi Yossi Aglili, who sang in the name of Rabbi Yossi Aglili, Sha'amar Mishum Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, who said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, Sha'amar Mishum Rabbi Eliezer Agadol, who sang in the name of the great Rabbi Eliezer, Ein Arla b'chutz la'aretz. There's no arla in the land of Israel. They were holding like Rabbi Eliezer Agadol. V'lo, the Gemara says he really holds there's no arla, outside the land of Israel. He held there's no arla outside the land of Israel. The Gemara asks, really? He held that? V'lo v'anan t'nar. But in our Mishnah that we had Rabbi Eliezer, and after the Mishnah had said that all the agricultural laws only apply in Israel except for kilayim and arla, which apply even outside the land of Israel, Rabbi Eliezer said, Rabbi Eliezer Omer Afa Chadash, that even Chadash applies outside of Israel. Now what does even mean? Even means I agree to the previous things. The previous things were that kilayim and arla apply outside the land of Israel. And comes Rabbi Eliezer and he says even Chadash. Sounds like he agrees that arla applies outside the land of Israel. So how could we have this whole report in the name of Rabbi Eliezer Agadol? That's this Rabbi Eliezer, that arla does not apply in Israel. In the Mishnah he said that even Chadash applies outside the land of Israel, implying that arla also does. So the Gemara says, Tani Chadash. You have to rewrite the Mishnah. He didn't, it's not supposed to say af. That really he was just saying the first opinion held that Chadash doesn't apply outside of Israel. Rabbi Eliezer comes and says Chadash does apply. But with regards to arla, we have a tradition here that he holds that arla does not apply outside the land of Israel. And that's the opinion that the Charifi of Pumbedisa, the sharp ones of Pumbedisa, were going with, they were reporting. But Rabbi Yochanan was quite unhappy with that and disagreed with it, apparently quite strongly. And so he made sure that Rabbi Huda made it clear that any arla that's certainly arla, even if it's outside of Israel, has to be destroyed. And he said anybody who says that arla doesn't apply outside the land of Israel is their children. It's not going to work out well for their offspring. Okay, we'll hold here and pick up next time. Eretz Hashem.